Portraits! Ah! It's that time. We have to draw a portrait. I don't know how to do that. I can't draw people. How in the world can I do this if I can barely draw a stick figure? I've already heard this 1,000 times. Sit back, relax, trust me. I am gonna make this easy for you. So, where do I start? The Impossible Portrait. By far the most challenging and scary thing for my students to draw in my class. There's such a stigma to drawing people that people will ultimately not even try or attempt to draw a person just because they feel like they can't get it right. I'm gonna break this down for you in a simple way. I use a technique called comparative measurement. Comparative measurement will take one object on a person's face and compare it to other objects, and it will tell me the relationship between one object and the other object. For me personally, I prefer to start from the center of the face, the nose. What a fantastic place to start. Now, when it comes to drawing the actual portrait on the paper, I usually don't start with any outside lines of a portrait because I feel like it gives me a little bit of a struggle and it forces me into this box to create the face inside of this area that I have given myself or designated for myself to draw in. Obviously, there are a lot of techniques out there that would definitely choose to do exactly what I just told you not to do. Again, as you're doing portraits, you have to find what works for you best. This is my own method. I appreciate it, and it helps me make it through the portrait process easier. So instead of starting with this giant outline that is going to force me to fit everything, all of my features inside of this outline, I choose to start by giving myself maybe a slight dash mark that might say, I want the bottom of the chin here. I may want the top of the head here, and maybe I might give myself a tiny bit of an idea of where the width of the face is. So you can see these are very subtle lines, but I need you to know right now ahead of time, these lines are flexible. They're just there kind of as a boundary to help myself understand. I don't want to go too much bigger than that, don't want to go too much smaller than that, but it is flexible, always, always flexible. So here we are. Let's get into drawing this nose. If I've started with a basic outline, then I might come in and just briefly tell myself about where things are. You now realize that the outline is from the hair, the top of the hair, to the bottom of the chin. So if I were to go back to that whole egg shape technique, then I would understand that about halfway through would be the eyes. So with that knowledge in mind, then I do need to understand that I can't just put the nose in the dead center of the face. It has to be a little bit dropped down because again, this is not just the face, this is the entire skull. So as I drop down, I look at the halfway mark and I can give myself a little dash as to where I want to start. So here's how I would draw a nose. The very first thing that I need to make sure that I pay attention to is the angle of the nose. You have to understand that the nose is not always perfectly straight on the face. It can be angled, and many, many other things can affect the way that this nose will look. For the particular nose that I'm working with, I have seen that it is at a 3/4 turn, which means that it's turning slightly away from me. So as I work for this, through this nose, this is how I choose to go about it. I start with the bulb of the nose, just a very simple shape. This is a shape that I feel like is often overlooked by students and often is over-exaggerated. So the bulb of the nose usually tends to be larger in student drawings. So I have the bulb of the nose and I base it in. Then I work straight into the nostril. You can choose which nostril you want to go into. I don't ever pick one or the other, but I pay attention to a lot of things. I pay attention to where this nostril finishes or ends at in comparison to the bulb in my nose. And then as I draw on the other nose, the other nostril on the other side, I pay attention to its shape. Because, as I said, the head that I'm drawing from is a 3/4 turn, my nose is going to be smaller on the section pointed away from me because of perspective. The side closest to me will be larger. As it goes away, it gets smaller. So I have the bulb established and both nostrils. I did this in basically one single swipe. So a lot of times you could do just a single line as you pass through here. Now, it's important that you understand that I have to make sure that my nostrils are perfectly in place in comparison to the bulb of my nose. And as I've observed this picture, I'm realizing that the nostril on this side is just above the bulb of the nose, and the nostril on this side over here drops just in line with the bulb of the nose. So from here, I can start getting the nostril flares or wings or whatever you would like to call them on the outside of the nose. And this is how I would go about that. I use a very gestured technique here, so I'm very loose with my sketches. I'm not extremely controlled in the front end of my drawing. I will control it a lot more at the end, but for now, this is where I'm at. So I'm getting just the base of the nose in, and this is about where I go from here. So I have the nose. Now here's a giant common error that students would make, or an amateur artist, or anyone who hasn't done portraits much. They immediately go into drawing the bridge of the nose. Now here's the thing that's so important. The bridge of the nose is not a hard line at all. It's just created by the use of shadows or values on the face. So in the portrait that I'm drawing, on one particular side, the bridge of the nose is just a little bit more pronounced. So I might come in and get this idea. However, I need to understand that the drawing that I'm putting in has to be light enough that it can blend back into the face. Because if I'm drawing realism, then I need to know that all of these lines that exist in the beginning will disappear into the shadows or the values of the face. So I have the bulb of the nose started here. You can see the shape. And now I would do what I call mapping in. So as I map in the face here, or the nose rather, I start to think about the shadows and where they go. I find that there's a nice shadow that runs underneath the bulb of the nose here, and then this shadow follows out onto this nostril over on this side over here. So I might just kind of base that in a little bit. And again, this shadow or this hard line that creates the bridge of the nose will disappear into shadows. One of the shadows is the shadow that runs right up the bridge of the nose. And so I have a base of the nose in. On the other side over here, I'm realizing in the photo that it does not have much of any actual shape or line to it. So instead of coming in and putting a hard line in, I might just put in a little bit of a value there just to give myself the idea that it is in fact going up. So here are some key, very, very key things that you need to understand as you are drawing a portrait. Shadows tend to help things sink or wrap back in space on a portrait or anything in that regard. And highlights tend to help something stand out. So if it's darker, it's going to sink. If it's lighter, it's going to stand out. So if we look at a nose, then we immediately understand that it gets darker as it wraps underneath. And as it comes back up to the top or the bridge of the nose and the bulb of the nose, we have a stark highlight. In fact, on the face, that's one of the brightest places that we might see. We see a very strong highlight that goes through the face here. So as I'm drawing this nose, now I'm just going to start laying in some values. The darkest value on the nose is obviously going to be right in the nostril itself. So I will work in that value. Now, as I'm shading this in, I'm not going to use a shading stump or anything like that. I may end up using a shading stump in the end, but in the very beginning, I like to just use a lot of cross-hatching or scrumbling as well. So that would just be a pretty term for the term scribbling, but I'm using it controllingly. I'm not just going crazy and scribbling all over the place. So I'm just really paying attention to the nose that I'm drawing, and I'm observing all of the deep shadows and the darkest value in the nose, the nostril. So if this is the darkest value, everything else will be a value scale down. So this might be a number 10 or a 9 in the value scale. And as we drop down, we start losing that value. So I might drop down to a 7 or an 8 in the value scale. So now I'm starting to draw my nose. The key to this, again, in trying to get realism, is making all of these lines that I've just established disappear into the face. So as I'm working around the nose, I start to help all of these lines disappear into the actual face. Again, I'm using either cross-hatching or basic scribbling. Very controlled scribbling, as I'm paying so much attention to the actual portrait itself. I'm establishing all of my mid-tone values based off of the darkest dark and the lightest light. There's a strong highlight on the portrait that I'm using that goes about right here. And again, I'm not going to put a bunch of outlines everywhere to tell me where everything is. I'm just going to give myself some subtle value changes to help this nose start to protrude off the face. So the other key factor to the nose that is so left out is understanding that the nose is in fact connected to the face. So it's not a separate entity. It is connected to the face, and to connect it to the face, I have to understand the values that are happening around it. Once I understand these values, it's also so helpful in creating the idea that this thing is protruding off of the face, because as it gets closer to the cheek structure or the forehead area or the lip area, it starts to get darker. And the darker those areas are, the more they will sink into the face. So I'm going to let the side sections of the nose start to sink into the face, as the highlights in the center of the nose start to protrude. As I look over at my portrait, I'm realizing that there's some really strong darks going on around the nose here. And those darks help all of these values all of a sudden pop off the page. So here we are. I'm going to go into time lapse for just a second so I can kind of work this nose a little bit further into finish, and then I will touch back with you in just a moment. All right, so I've worked up a little bit more value throughout this time lapse. And as I was working it up, I was thinking about a few things that are really important as I'm shading a nose. Again, obviously understanding that highlights are going to help things stick out and shadows are going to help things sink in. So this is a very basic nose. It's going to be very sketch-like. I could spend so long on this nose to actually get it to approach a much more realistic photorealistic portrait, but for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to keep this a little bit more sketchy, but I do feel like I have the actual form of the nose happening here, where it looks like it is three-dimensional, even if it's just basic. So keys to this would be, again, that strong highlight passing down the center, the darkness or the values that are helping wrap around the nose, the actual face itself. As I progress throughout this portrait, all of these values are going to help this area stand out even more and sink in certain areas as well. So something else that I noticed as I was drawing is that I did leave this very subtle highlight right here. This is called a reflective highlight. It is always there. It just depends on what is going on inside of this photo, but it's really good. It's a good light or highlight inside of your nose drawing to help separate the darkness of underneath the nose to the darkness of the bulb. So there's always just a subtle highlight. And it doesn't really pass all the way through the nose itself, but it is there. There's usually a little bit on top of the nostril and then just a little bit underneath the bulb of the nose. And it's going to vary from portrait to portrait. So I think the key to this in drawing nose, the keys to all of portraiture, is observation. I can spend so much time actually observing the person and trying to figure out what I need to do. And I think that is what's going to help my portrait become as realistic as possible. And maybe even not as realism, or if realism is not necessarily where you're going, at least I can catch the likeness of a person through observation. The more I look at this person that I'm drawing, the more it is going to become the person that I'm actually drawing. So, some other things to just take note of before I sign off on this one is this. I've come to quite a bit of completion with this nose. In the actual finale of the portrait, I would probably not spend this much time shading the actual nose. In the front end, I might come in and map out things. So I'm going to use this nose in the next video in comparative measurement, and it's going to be fantastic to help me figure out where I need to go from here. I personally love going from the nose into the eyes and from the eyes down into the mouth. And from there, I go to the outline. But this right here is a fantastic place to start because it is the center of the face, and it is definitely one of the first things that we look at in a portrait. Aside from the eyes, this is the largest thing that we can draw on the face. And I like to think of it kind of as a tree. It's going to be able to start at the trunk, it will branch up into the eyes, and then its roots will fall down into the mouth. It's such a convenient way for me to think. I hope that this was helpful for you today in drawing a nose.